Thank you to all of you who chose to brave the conditions and come today. I'm going to be lecturing without a mask, so if you perhaps want to take a seat further back, but in front is fine too. I'll stay more behind the desk today. Today's lecture is an amalgam. It's put together from the intended lecture of last week, from this week's, from some elements of the coming week. In some sense, it might lack a little bit of the overall coherence that some of our lectures have because it tries to do so many different things. But the main aim of today's lecture, and I have more slides here than I will be able to show you, but is to think about what happens to Europe and to a lesser extent today, Russia. We already talked about that some on Friday, after the Second World War. How the European myth of modernity, with its promises of development and democracy, changes or remains the same after the Second World War. And that's maybe a good question to have in the back of your heads. Does Europe profoundly or fundamentally change after the Second World War in terms of its ideals, its identity, its myths, its power? And like all good questions, I think this question has an answer that is both yes and no, and a question that is very much open to debate, and something that hopefully we will be able to debate in our final official discussion a week from this coming Friday. One thing I also hope to do for you today, because I've changed I extended the Bakhtin and Barth reading over the course of 2 weeks to give you some more time to digest this somewhat difficult literary and linguistic analysis, is also to think about how the writings of Barth and Bakhtin become especially relevant in the post-war era, in the era of Cold War Europe. What is it that about the way they write and about their analysis of culture and of society, of political power, acquires extraordinary relevance and resonance in this period? Hopefully we'll get to Barth and Bakhtin by the end of the lecture in the final section, but to do so we'll have to move quickly through some of the intervening sections. I begin today's lecture on Cold War Europe with these images at the top. You notice important places that have labels in some cases, no labels in others. You see Adolf Hitler Platz there on the left. It's probably in Berlin. You see the Lenin and Stalin's tomb, and both of their names are there on the mausoleum. And then the image in the middle, any idea what that is? A question, what might that be? It's actually perhaps one of the most famous things at all, but not one that has been commemorated at all in visual culture, and maybe for a good reason. What's in the middle is Hitler's bunker during the Second World War, where it was very quickly after the war bulldozed to the ground and converted into basically a parking lot where you would have no capacity or ability to remember what happened there, what was there. Other places like Adolf Hitler Platz or Adolf Hitler Straße here, Adolf Hitler Street, were renamed in the aftermath of the war. You can see the replacement of one sign by another. It becomes Roosevelt Boulevard. And Lenin and Stalin, who occupied a position after Stalin's death in the tomb, in the mausoleum, eventually, Stalin's body was taken out and it was buried behind the mausoleum as a maybe gesture toward his enduring importance, but reduced importance in Soviet history and in Soviet iconography, when Lenin became the only central and infallible, you can say, figure in Soviet history. So what do all of these images have in common, and what do all these images, what are they evidence of? Often in history, I think we do our best thinking when we think backwards. We think from the images and evidence we have to the questions that we might ask in order to get there. I think the question that gets us to all of these images is the question about the politics of memory. How, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Europe and the Soviet Union both became unprecedentedly backward-looking. They became unprecedentedly concerned with what had happened in the past. If you remember, modernity and modernism is all about the future. It's about moving forward to a new age, into a new time, transforming humanity, making it more democratic, making it more developed. So looking backwards, you could say, is in a very profound sense in tension with the promises of modernity and with modernism. But in the aftermath of World War II, say both Europe and Russia had lived through an enormous, an exceptional and unprecedented trauma, and coming to terms with what happened in the Second World War, with who was in power, with all the death, with all the genocide and destruction, took up, you could say, basically the rest of the century. There was no country in Europe, and certainly Russia and the Soviet Union were no exception, that did not spend an enormous amount of time and energy commemorating the past, trying to figure out who to remember and who to forget, what to say about what had happened. In our discussion on Friday, we had a prime example of one of these moments where the politics of memory comes to play a really important role in Soviet history. In reading Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech, you could say it's an artifact from this post-war preoccupation with memory and with the politics of memory. And talking about it and arguing about whether it was the right thing to say or the only thing to say or whether he could have said something else, we were actually participating in the very kinds of debates people were having all over and around Europe and around into Russia over the course of the last 50, 60, 70 years. In many ways, our debate about the secret speech is a microcosm, or was a microcosm, of the way in which the culture of Europe and Russia change after World War II. They become exceptionally self-critical, curious about what went wrong in the past, perhaps no longer so heroically striding towards the triumphant future in the modernist spirit. If there is a way in which you would say the culture of the 20s and 30s is foreign to us now, might be best encapsulated in that, in the way in which the culture becomes more tentative, more questioning, and more uncertain. But I want to move now to the first major section of this lecture, the myth of global solidarity, by introducing you in a more formal way than we managed to do on Friday to the third and final great myth of our course. The final myth by which you could say Europe and Russia attempt to define their place in the world. I'll remind you of the first two myths, the Faustian myth of development, really, the myth of national self-determination, which attempts to, you could say, limit the Faustian myth by a promise of a certain type of democracy. But in the aftermath of the Second World War, facing the traumas, you could say, of history that both Europe and the Soviet Union had experienced, there was a need for and a call for a way of imagining the whole, a way of imagining all of Europe and all of Russia at the head of the world. You could say the myth of global solidarity is the myth that tried to save the story of Europe and the story of Russia for modernity by speaking in exceptionally grandiose terms about what Europe meant and what Russia meant. The Soviet Union and Europe, if European leaders, continued in their quest for making the world that was promised in 1848. And we're going to look in this section of the lecture, first of all, at that promise, and focusing more on Europe this time than on Russia, but also at the way in which that promise was complicated by the circumstances facing Europeans in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Now, the promise of a European unity was not original, you could say, to the year 1945. It goes back a long way. We might remember that already in 1948-49, Victor Hugo is speaking of the great, of a United States of Europe, trying to imagine a United States of Europe. And even his projection of a belief of global or international solidarity and unity has older origins. He looks back, and many look back, to the church that we talked about in Lecture 1, the notion of a united Christian civilization. We could even look back to the age or the rule of Charlemagne. These are sort of leaders that are invoked often. But you could say the promise of a European Union acquires a very modern form and a very, you could say, recognizable form in the writings of the Count Richard Nicolaus Coudenhove-Kalergi, a man with a divided identity. He was also known as Aoyama Eijiro due to his Japanese mother. A man who lived from 1894 to 1972. This is really basically his years span those of the first Soviet generation and the first great idealists of Europe. But nobody was more idealistic than Coudenhove-Kalergi. Every great political event, he claimed, began as a utopia and ended as a reality. One could imagine the Soviets saying exactly the same thing about Bolshevism. And the Pan-European Union, which he talked about and projected already in the 1920s, and for which he developed this flag, which you see above, already starts to resemble in many ways what the European Union comes to look like after the Second World War. His father was an Austrian count, Heinrich von Coudenhove-Kalergi, an Austro-Hungarian diplomat, a man who was committed to an idea of international ties and relations. His mother, Mitsuko Aoyama, was the daughter of an oil merchant, antiques dealer, and a land-owning family in Tokyo. So he grew up between two languages. He grew up between two civilizations, you might say. He was aristocratic in Europe. He was certainly a member of the kind of the industrial entrepreneurial class in Japan. And like many people with double or dual identities, he suffered, you could say, from a sense of homelessness, as an uncertainty about where he was actually from or who he actually was. He grew up as, you could say, a citizen or a subject, rather, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when national self-determination came to Eastern Europe, he became a Czechoslovak citizen in 1919. Following the outbreak or the takeover of Europe by Hitler and the occupation of Czechoslovakia, he became a French citizen in 1939, which he remained until his death. But all through his life, he was looking for a way of imagining his place in the world as something that transcended any particular nation. From 1923 to 72, he was the president and co-founder of the Pan-European Union, and he found some very powerful and influential supporters for him in this endeavor. The Otto von Habsburg, an important member of the ruling family of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was his collaborator in this project. It's useful to remember that in the 1920s, this vision or hope for Pan-Europa was already acquiring some kind of momentum. And it's also worth remembering that as far back as the 1920s, Coudenhove-Kalergi's vision for Europe was one that would stand against Russia. He saw the Bolshevik takeover in the Soviet Union as something that was very dangerous to the vision of the world that he imagined and to the virtues and to the values that he wanted to propagate. I like to begin any kind of talk or any discussion of the European Union with a mention of Coudenhove-Kalergi, because we forget sometimes that the origins of the European Union are in some sense aristocratic. His ideal of Europe was a very aristocratic one. He wanted to bring back chivalry, sort of feudal sort of relations between men and women. He wanted to bring back all kinds of things we might think of as very old-fashioned, bring back a sense of honor, a sense of dignity that had been lost, you could say, in the modernizing world. He's in many ways, you could say, a product of modernity, but a product of modernity with very strong conservative, you could say, impulses and allegiances. But he got many of the most progressive people in Europe, at least in the German-speaking world, to sign on. In 1926, he staged the first Congress for Pan-Europa in Vienna, a city that we're going to look more closely at in a second, and which we have been looking at more throughout this course, because I think Vienna, maybe better than any other city, contains in microcosm the big story of Europe's attempt to become modern, to become democratic and developed, than maybe any other. At the first Congress, and this is a good example of one of the ways in which it does that, and staging the first Congress for the vision of a pan-European worldview. 200 participants came, including figures like Albert Einstein, Thomas Mann, Sigmund Freud, all of these people from diverse walks of life, representing the most advanced developments in science, the most advanced developments in literature, the most advanced developments in the social sciences, were all, in their own ways, enthusiastic about Coudenhove-Kalergi's vision. This was the vision that underlay, in many ways, the birth of the European Union a few years later. And before we move on to the myths or the dark sides of these myths and the ways in which the realization of this vision of solidarity was not possible, I want simply to enumerate some of the elements in the European Union that give Europe both a continued and a new identity for the post-war era. The May 9th, 1950 Schuman Declaration, so named after the French Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister at various times, is in some ways an artificial date. Picking May 9th was a speech, a very powerful speech he gave, and we'll look at some of that text in just a minute. And it has become to be known in retrospect as Europe Day. But at the time, it wasn't perhaps very it wasn't very clear what was going on, what was happening. What Robert Schuman was in many ways doing was carrying into life many elements of Coudenhove-Kalergi's vision for a new Europe. He wanted to, and the two things you could say that he took from Coudenhove-Kalergi that were maybe less conservative and are still very much parts of the European Union's vision of itself today, is this notion of a promise of world peace, making a world in which, he says, war was not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. There was a bunch of, or a lot of, you could say, idealism in Kalergi's and in Schumann's vision, and what they both wanted to accomplish or to achieve was a Europe without war, a Europe where the conflicts of the previous 30 years would never repeat themselves. And his solution to it, and this might be somewhat original, in a Keynesian spirit, and perhaps fulfilling maybe the promise of the Coudenhove-Kalergi text we read for last Friday, was to do this not on a moral level, but on an economic level. Make war not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. If you can remember what Keynes had told us in his economic consequences of the peace, was that countries that trade together, that depend on one another economically, are less likely to, or should be less likely to, attack one another. The more, in other words, the more we can increase the economic connections and mutual interdependence of nations, the less we will have to fear that they were going to fight one another. And the problem in World War I, according to Keynes, was that the Germans and the French and the Italians and the British, they just didn't see it. The Americans too. They were blind to this fact. But by World War II, you can say Keynesianism has become the dominant economic philosophy in the world, at least in the European world. And this notion of creating, through economic interdependence, a world where war is no longer possible. It's interesting and significant, and this is maybe goes back to the irony and the paradox I pointed out to you on the very first day of lecture, that the Soviet Union always promised a world based on an economic philosophy, but actually was entirely, you can say, political in its accomplishments. And the European Union was kind of the opposite. It promised a political world, a world of justice, of freedom, of human rights, but its greatest successes, and perhaps its only successes, have really been economic. Going back to the 1952 European coal and steel community, the unions, the organizations that have made Europe have largely been ones based upon coordinating economic interests. In this case, the coal and steel community aimed to do something that Hitler had tried to do, is show the interdependence of the Rhineland, Germany and France, Benelux, all on one another. And from this emerged, a few years later, the Treaty of Rome, the European Economic Community, the European Atomic Energy Community, and Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany became the beginning, you could say, the nucleus of the new Europe. In this story, I just want to emphasize for you again how economically driven all of this is. The goal is a political and moral one, but the means is economic. Opposite, you could say, for the Soviet Union. Culminates many years later. This is getting ahead of ourselves in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty and full economic integration, and eventually, of course, the adoption of the euro, an economic currency. But trying to come up with a constitution for Europe, this has proved impossible. A political constitution that will express everything that Europe really believes in. Nonetheless, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Europe, born out of the vision of Nova Clarity, implemented by Robert Schuman and the first president of the CSC, Jean Monnet, an entrepreneurial figure, a man who believes in sort of a practical economic engagement, was without its idealistic rhetoric and discourse. And we find that idealism perhaps best embodied. We mentioned this very briefly in our seminar on Friday, but in Robert Schumann's May 9th or May 1949 writings here. We are carrying out a great experiment, the fulfillment of the same recurrent dream that for 10 centuries has revisited the peoples of Europe, creating between them an organization, putting an end to war and guaranteeing an eternal peace. Now look how he looks back at distant European history to make his story, to make this vision of Europe more resonant. The Roman Church of the Middle Ages failed finally in its attempts that were inspired by humane and human preoccupations. Another idea, that of a world empire constituted under the auspices of German emperors, was less disinterested. It already relied on the unacceptable pretensions of a Führertum, domination by dictatorship, whose charms we have all experienced. This is his brief reference, of course, not only to the Bismarckian age, but to the rise of Hitler. The European spirit signifies being conscious of belonging to a cultural family and having a willingness to serve that community in the spirit of total mutuality, without any hidden motives of hegemony or the selfish exploitation of others. The 19th century saw feudal ideas being opposed, and with the rise of a national spirit, nationalities asserting themselves. Our century, that has witnessed the catastrophes resulting in the unending clash of nationalities and nationalisms, must attempt and succeed in reconciling nations in a supranational association. This would safeguard the diversities and aspirations of each nation while coordinating them in the same manner as the regions are coordinated within the unity of the nation. Find echoes, perhaps, of the language of Victor Hugo here. When back in 1849, he spoke of how the regions of France have come together, and now the countries of Europe must come together in the same way. But I take the myth of global solidarity, partly from this speech or from this text here, and the optimism and idealism of it should be noticed, even as we go on to notice how unlikely an environment Europe provides in the immediate years after the Second World War for the fulfillment of this promise and of this dream. Part of the problem, of course, lies in the uncertainty in the relationship between Russia and Europe, between the Soviet Union and Europe at the end of the Second World War. The Soviet Union is actually speaking a very similar language, or using very similar discourse. From now on, the great banner of freedom of peoples and peace between nations will fly over Europe. It sounds like it could have come from Robert Schuman or Jean Monnet. But guess who said this? This is, in fact, Joseph Stalin, speaking at the end of the Second World War. I'm hoping with this you'll start to notice how the problem of language and the rhetorical use of language to construct power, and the different ways in which language can be used to advance our aims and also conceal our objectives, becomes a concern with which both Mikhail Bakhtin and Roland Barthes preoccupy themselves. But this peculiar quotation, or this you can say European quotation that in fact comes from Stalin, is something I copied down or found on a trip I took last November when we were still allowed to move around the world, from Vienna. Here's a picture of me standing in front of a monument in Vienna, and you notice the monument in Vienna is actually in Russian. You see the Narodov Evropy at the end, And this is actually the statement here about a great banner of freedom of peoples and peace between nations will fly over Europe. What is this kind of monument doing in Vienna? When you look more closely at it, you see it's actually a monument, this is how big it is, in fact, to the fallen soldiers of the monument to the Soviet soldiers fallen in the struggle, again, using that old 19th century language we've been talking about, against German fascists for freedom and the independence of the peoples of Europe. And it was erected, or a gift to, or you could say, to Vienna from Stalin for the liberation of Vienna from the fascists. And it stands to this day. You can see even here Stalin's name is preserved on the monument. And of course, when strolling through Vienna, and this is not a city that was on the eastern side of the Cold War, it was on the western side. But it reminds us of the extent to which the problem of making sense of how Europe was in fact going to go forward was something that was fought over at every step and became a source of all kinds of controversy and debate. I haven't yet posted the final version of the final paper assignment, but one thing I had students do last year was pick a moment or a monument from sort of the contemporary world to analyze more closely in light of the discourses that we've talked about in this class. And I always imagine that this monument would make a wonderful kind of example of that. The Viennese mayor and the Viennese and the Austrian government built an enormous fountain in front of this monument to kind of conceal it. Putin paid a visit to this monument a year or two ago and wanted to see how it was being taken care of. It's still part of the discourse of Europe and Russia. And it's interesting, of course, that Stalin's name has been retained here at the heart of one of the most European cities, even while it was being erased at the same time from monuments in the Soviet Union. Vienna, as a microcosm of Europe, is a particularly resident place in the years in the immediate aftermath of World War II, from 1944 to 55. Vienna, even before Berlin, got divided up by various occupying forces. You can see Russia, the Russian ones. Russia has the most control of Vienna, all the outer lying regions. The Americans have perhaps the second largest sector under their control. The French, the smallest, because, of course, as the British and the Americans continue to remind the French that they capitulated first during the Second World War. And the British have a very significant, you could say, territory to dominate as well. But I think in looking at this map, we can see something larger about the fate of Europe in the post-war world. For the first time, the colonizer has been colonized. For the first time, the source of world historical modernity, development, and democracy is being subjected to its own medicine and is perhaps at the other end of the stick. And nothing, I think, brings this out better than the American film, The Third Man, produced in 1949, filmed in post-war Vienna, about post-war Vienna. The opening quote, or line from the film, is wonderful, I think, because it really captures what has happened to Europe in the post-war world. The narrator says to us, "I never knew the old Vienna before the war, with its Strauss music, its glamour, and its easy charm. Now the city is divided into 4 zones, each occupied by a power, American, British, Russian, and the French. But the center of the city, that's international, policed by an international patrol, all strangers to the place, and none of them could speak the same language." That is the setting for this film. And of course, if we're talking about the myth of international solidarity, there's no place that embodies that promise or that, you can say, that vision better than that tiny little sector at the middle, the white part, the international zone at the center of Vienna, that's supposed to be the property of all nations in all places, that's supposed to represent perhaps an ideal, a way of bringing all the nations together, overcoming the differences between them, in the way that a few years later Robert Schuman would speak about in his speech. Oh, more pictures of me. Standing in front of the Vienna Ferris wheel. The Vienna Ferris wheel is the site of, and I want to play this clip from the movie, which is why I'm setting this up at such length for you. The Vienna Ferris wheel was constructed in 1898 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the rule of Franz Joseph, the Habsburg Emperor. Remember, Franz Joseph had ruled from 1848 to 1898. The Ferris wheel was constructed to commemorate his rule while he was still in power. And now the film is filmed there in 1948, 50 years later. History has come full circle. And the scene, you can see, taking place aboard the Vienna Ferris wheel is, in some sense, a gesture to this question that I posed in the second lecture. Does history move in a line, or does it move in a circle? Are we constantly repeating itself, or are we moving forward with progress, with modernity, with something new? Last thing to say to set up the scene. The scene is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between two characters in the film. The main character, who is the third man himself, Harry Lime, played by the famous Hollywood director Orson Welles, is the kind of villain and the hero at the same time in this film. In the truly unregulated black market of the international zone of Vienna after the war, Harry Lime makes a fortune selling diluted penicillin to hospitals, which kills some children and drives others insane. He's making use of an unregulated economy to make a profit, in other words. He fakes his own death, but is tracked down by his childhood friend, Holly Martin, played by the actor Joseph Cotton. And then they have a confrontation about what Harry Lime is using this newfound internationalist freedom to do, and what matters in the world, and what we should take our moral principles from. Watch. You notice the scene also comes full circle. It ends precisely where it began, with the same music playing, walking through the amusement park. Of course, the setting of the scene in an amusement park is telling too. It's what do people have to preoccupy them in the post-war world? Amusement parks. And I hope you noticed, and maybe you can watch this again, of course, being on Panopto, you can look for the themes that are kind of mentioned in here. Nobody believes in human beings. People talk about the people and the proletariat. I talk about the suckers and the mugs. It's the same thing, he says. Do you believe in God? These are all the questions of the post-war world. Is God helpful or hurtful for a vision of a better society and for a vision of the promises of European modernity? What about talking about the people and the proletariat? When we talk about them, are we making the world better? And when we look down from those great heights at those little people moving below, and we see them all like ants, how can you think about them as human beings who are worthy of being reckoned with? These are the large existential philosophical questions of post-war Europe and post-war Soviet Union as well. You might remember the apocryphal quotation often attributed to Stalin, but that, if one person dies, it's a tragedy, but if a million die, it's a statistic. This is, you could say, in some ways, the atmosphere of the post-war world. Millions dead no longer touches us the same way as the death of one person. And that's partly where the politics of memory also comes from, is trying to figure out how to make sense of all of this trauma. But the most important line here, the most famous, is the last one. And I've written it up for you because it's so resonant. In Italy, for 30 years, under the Borgia family, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. At the same time, in Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. Well, this is Harry Lime's very provocative statement about the relationship between development and democracy. What is the price of development? The price of development is warfare, terror, murder, bloodshed. That's the way you get Michelangelo. That's the way you get Leonardo da Vinci. That's the way you create a new world order where new things happen. The new man, making the new society requires sacrifice and death and destruction. Maybe democracy should not even be that great a value. Of course, Harry Lime, as the villain of this film, is not somebody we are inclined to believe, but as so often happens in literary works and films, the villains have the best lines. And they say the things that we really have to spend the most time mulling over. So watching this film, one might ask whether That promise of modernity, of integrated development and democracy, which I said in 1848, was the promise of Europe, was the promise of modernity. Whether it has come unraveled. To some extent, perhaps it has. At least for some people and in some ways, we see this question, or the people who are advocates of development moving in a completely different direction. Harry Lime is not a celebrator of democracy. He loves the anarchy of the international zone where nobody can keep an eye on him. But this scene and this episode also resonates with a discourse that starts to spread around the world and comes back to haunt Europe and the Soviet Union, but mostly Europe in this case, about what Europe has been doing all along. In the last lecture I managed to give to you on Hitler and Stalin, I presented both Hitler and Stalin to you, not as rejections of Europe and the Soviet promise, but as fulfillments of them. That was the provocative claim I made. But in fact, that claim is one that starts to be made by the entire world, the entire non-European world, beginning perhaps with Aimé Césaire, the Martinique-born, you could say, developer of the idea of négritude, or blackness, and a commentator, an important philosophical commentator on the impact of Europe, and perhaps especially the impact of France on its colonies all around the world. He was the teacher of Frantz Fanon, who's perhaps more famous than he was. Speaking about all of that death and destruction that comes, the murder, warfare, bloodshed that Harry Lime celebrates as necessary for making us move forward, he says that this has been part of Europe all along. We just didn't notice it. It wasn't Hitler who invented it. Hitler just participated in a tradition and in a set of technologies that was cultivated going all the way back to the Renaissance, maybe back to the Borgia family. In his essay on Europe as indefensible, he writes, people are always surprised. But these are Europeans are surprised, not the people in South America, not the people in Asia, not the people in Africa. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, how strange. But never mind, it's the Nazis. We'll get over the Nazis. The Nazis will pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, that it is Nazism. Yes, but before that, before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. Before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. The people who condemned Nazism first helped it to become powerful. The people who condemned Stalin first helped him to become powerful. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them. That they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had only been applied to non-European peoples. The whole story of Europe's domination of the world, of colonialism, in some sense, for Aimé Césaire, is in the same key as Hitler's domination. Only people became upset and noticed when Hitler did it, because he did it to Europeans. That was the two themes of European civilization that Césaire claims need to be reckoned with and dealt with. And this is maybe one of our large themes for the post-war world. Reckoning with the past, a moral reckoning with the past, trying to figure out what was good and what was bad about this earlier history of Europe, the story of modernity. The two unsolved problems for him, he picks out in this essay, are first, the question of class, or the proletariat. The inequality, the enormous inequality among people in the continent, that there's some people who are dirt poor and other people who are very, very rich. But Europe, for all of its development, has not solved this problem. In fact, perhaps it has even widened the gap, in some sense, between the richest and the poorest. And the other question is the one that touched him, you could say personally, most directly, the problem of empire. That Europe has remained, even as it proclaimed in this First World War, that the nation state should become the only unit of political legitimacy in the modern world. It remained, at the end of the Second World War, a continent of empires. The British Empire still reached all the way around the globe, and the French Empire was in a distant second place, but very, very powerful too. And the other European empires were still in existence. None of them had really been decolonized yet. So one of the great themes of the post-war world is also decolonization. Making good, you could say, on the promise of national self-determination in the First World War, but trying to figure out how to deal with this aspect of Europe's legacy. At the beginning of this section, I showed you a picture of the Stalin monument in Vienna, and the monument proclaiming peace and freedom and cooperation among all the peoples of Europe. Berlin, as a city, was also, you could say, a city that was, in some sense, liberated by both, by the West and by the East, by Soviet forces. And of course, the Soviet forces were the most prominent and the first ones there, as this Soviet flag on the Reichstag, the most famous photograph of Berlin at the end of the war, shows. So what we need to do in the second part of this lecture is look a little more closely at what the transformation of Europe at the end of the Second World War meant. And the term I'm using for this, and the term that was used at the time, is kind of an American term, but it's okay, I think I'll justify it in a second, De-Nazification. And the way in which Europe emerged out of the Second World War, not as both Stalin and Schuman wanted, as a united source of moral authority and power and control, but an unprecedentedly divided continent that was divided in two for the first time. At the end, at 0 hour, the moment when Berlin fell, there were 40 million casualties to the Second World War, and millions of more people who were uprooted as refugees. More homeless people were roaming the continent than ever before or since. People looking for new homes and new neighbors and new places. So demographically, socially, Europe was uprooted in a way that it hadn't been ever before. And by 1946, when Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech, it was already, you could say, visible, or the divide in Europe was already becoming visible. That the Soviets and the Americans and the French and the British, the winning powers, were not going to mount a united front. That in fact, there would be a profound division between them. So the rebuilding of Europe became, as I suggested before, a case of the colonizer colonized. And in fact, this is how Americans somehow wrote or talked about it. Now that the United Nations are beginning to reconquer Europe from the Nazis, the democratic phase of colonial policy comes into effect. What the Europeans used to refer to with a certain disdain as native politics is now being applied to them. Europeans, for the first time in history, are there in the position not of subjects, but of objects, you could say. And how did that express itself? We'll look a little bit more closely at these, but through all kinds of the institutions that were used to reorganize and remake Europe. The 1947 Marshall Plan pumped some $12 or $13 billion, $130 billion by today's standards of American dollars, into the rebuilding of Europe. Largely in Britain and France, first of all, in Germany too. And at the same time, or a few years later, the Soviet Union, together with its allied Warsaw Pact nations, developed Comecon, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which contributed to the rebuilding of states on the other side of the Iron Curtain. For Europeans, one thing this meant, I think, socially and culturally, is a kind of a withdrawal from the heroic narratives of history in which they had been the subjects and objects of their own development. And modernity seemed to be of Europe's making. Because Europe, for the first time, was in a subject kind of position. And along the way, a lot of people, and you can say a lot of people in large cities, lost their faith in grand schemes. The German philosopher and critic, Franz Neumann, expressed it very well. He said, "The deliberate rejection of politics and parties, ironic and sarcastic attitudes towards Nazism, denazification, democracy, and anti-fascism, and concentration on finishing one's education as speedily as possible and on a position, money, and on consumer goods, this is what the new Europe had become." It had lost its kind of idealism or its sense of its larger world historical purpose. We don't have to take Franz Neumann's comment as adequate for describing everything that happened. And if I will remind you again of where we started with Kurt Ove Kalergi's promise and Robert Schumann's speech, that's very optimistic, very idealistic. But on a level of everyday life, of the people one meets in the street, it did seem that there were fewer people inclined or willing to sign up for political parties and for political movements. They were, as the Greek writer Theotokos wrote, tired of history. That's a wonderful phrase, I think, and a wonderful way of encapsulating, perhaps, the mood or the atmosphere of the post-war world. The atmosphere we see in some sense in The Third Man, when Harry Lime and Joseph Cotton's character confront one another. They're interested only in their own personal lives, or Harry Lime at least is only interested in his own personal sort of profit. The larger questions of where the world is going, idealistic imaginings of the future, building a world that is safe for democracy and also safe for development, all of that has fallen to a second place, or is no longer, it seems, as much part of the aspiration. De-Nazification was actually a term that first invented by the Americans in 1943, even before the war was over. And it came to be associated especially with the Nuremberg trials. 1945 to 1946, judges from the victors, US, British, French, Soviet, presided at the trial of the great Nazi war criminals, or this was the way it was presented. And the hope was, of course, to deal with the politics of memory, to figure out how to assign blame for the atrocities of the Holocaust and of the Second World War. And remember, it was starting to echo what happened after World War I. But basically putting all the blame on what happened on Germany. There were 13 trials, 22 major Nazis were executed, 12 were tried and 12 were executed. And along the way, the combined legal forces of the French, the British, the Soviets, and the Americans developed denazification directives. The aim for the Americans, the Morgenthau Plan, was to reduce Germany basically to subsistence farming, so it ceased to no longer be able to be a modern, really, nation. And it's from this moment, too, that we get the modern kind of debate about realism in politics. Politics among the nations, sort of Morgenthau's, or the vision is the place where sort of this vision for the future was articulated. 1946, the law for liberation from National Socialism and militarism was sort of imposed from above, you could say, by the victors on Germany. And along the way, there were also some 545 civilian tribunals, and people were classified into 5 categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and the exonerated, people who were basically, these are for Germans mostly, but for members of any nation who were seen as having collaborated with the Nazis. In the meantime, the top 785 Nazi scientists were removed to the United States and put to work on the U.S. sort of nuclear projects. So the Nuremberg has become kind of a symbol, again, of victor's justice, of an attempt to impose a justice that will satisfy the entire world, but actually becomes really, seems to be a contribution to American especially, and to Allied interests more generally. One of the executed at the trial, Joachim von Ribbentrop, you might remember him from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the man who basically signs with Molotov the pact that creates the alliance between Hitler and Stalin, says, "You'll see, a few years from now, the lawyers of the world will condemn this trial. You can't have a trial without law." It's interesting that Ribbentrop was put to death for his involvement in the Nazi regime, and basically it was not much more than, say, Molotov's involvement was in Stalinism. But of course, Molotov was on the side of the winners. And so ultimately, you have, in this case, a situation in which it seems like the winners decide who is to live and who is to die, and the losers accept the fate imposed upon them. Along with this juridical aspect of denazification is the development of a new concept for legal discourse in Europe and in the world. The concept of genocide is invented in this moment. And often cited in talking about genocide is one of Hitler's speeches from 1939, very early on, where you notice that Hitler is talking about Europe's lack of memory, failure to have, maybe, to remember what happened in the past. Hitler said at that point, this is right around the time of the first invasion of Poland by the Nazis. Our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I've placed my death head formation in readiness, with orders to them to send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus shall we gain the living space or Lebensraum that we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Hitler cites the absence of a word, genocide, for the Armenians as, in some sense, justification for what he's doing at the moment to the Poles and about to do to the Jews. Perhaps this obsession with the politics of memory after the Second World War comes partly from the recognition that nobody cared about memory before, or did not care enough about it. That what happened to the Armenians during the making of the modern Turkish state was basically not talked about or ignored. And Hitler himself used this as inspiration for his modernization of Germany, for his transformation of Germany. He says, nobody cares about the past. Think back to Faust. Nobody cares about the old couple. Nobody cares about Gretchen. The story of making a new world involves sacrifices and removing people who stand in our way. And the only way we can acquire the courage and the heroism to move forward is to reconcile ourselves to a lot of very unpleasant acts of violence and cruelty. But this is all what is being called into question. This is all what is being, that was up for debate in the post-war world in a new way. Some, like Harry Lime and the Third Man, claim that we must soldier on and simply ignore the suffering. But most people want to deal with it in some way. And one way to deal with it is to develop new legal and concepts like genocide. The concept of genocide was coined by the Polish Jewish lawyer, partly thinking about these things that Hitler said in 1939, Raphael Lemkin. And Lemkin's pointed out something that international lawyers hadn't really paid much attention to before. That there's an important distinction between state sovereignty and human rights. Human rights is a term that's only now coming into currency in world history in this moment that we're talking about now. And that in international law, we have no way of dealing with a state that actually starts to persecute its own citizens. Of course, that is in some ways what the problem of the Holocaust was in legal terms, a state that starts to persecute its own citizens. International law always assumes, or had assumed up until the Second World War, that violence and persecution would be between states, would be against the members of another state. But what happens when a state decides that a certain member of its own population deserves to be annihilated or to be removed? The whole legal vocabulary of the modern world has no way of dealing with that. And that's where the term genocide came in, and how international law decided to start talking about international human rights. These sobering, you could say, aspects of the post-World War II environment are part also, you could say, of the blueprints for the new Europe that were omitted from or ignored in those very idealistic statements by people like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, but come to play a really important role in the way that Europe is actually reconstructed in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and going forward. The promise of a new world order for the post-war era, you could say, begins already much earlier, and we wouldn't be talking about it, of course, if the Germans had won the war. But since they didn't, and the Allies did, Churchill's and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Atlantic Charter of 1941 starts to try to draw out what a future will look like for Europe. They use some of the slogans that come from Coudenhove Kalergi and from Robert Schuman later, the idea of world peace, that's very important. Democratic development is emphasized there too. And they emphasize that we cannot give up on the ideal of national self-determination. That nation states must still be the ultimate units of political legitimacy, but they must somehow be better coordinated. So when we're looking at the post-war world as a whole, we might say one of the continuities is the enduring importance, the stress on national self-determination. And at the same time, a desire for a pursuit of a kind of organization, a logic that would do a better job than the League of Nations had done in making those nations work together. That's precisely what both Stalin and Schuman are talking about at the end of the Second World War. And along the way, you could say Europe learned two lessons from the 1930s. And it took me a while, actually, to develop these ideas because they're not very well articulated in a lot of the writings on this period. And they're hard to maybe make sense of because they are in contradiction with each other. But I think this might be the best way of understanding the dynamic, the political, social, cultural, intellectual dynamic of what comes in Europe in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The two lessons of the 1930s, I would argue to you, concern the state and the individual. And the product of the first, the lesson of the state, was the welfare state. Welfare state, which you could say had been projected in some sense. If you want to go very far back, it was the Bismarckian promise, but it was the Keynesian promise too. And it was the notion that he advanced in the 1920s and 30s, his economic philosophy, that we have to create a state that takes better care of its people than the states have done so far. Why? States that don't take care of their people and allow them to fall into poverty and misery cultivate an atmosphere out of which both Bolshevism and Nazism are born. The immiserated poor, the people who want to find radical solutions to their problems. A welfare state, in some sense, was the best argument against this for Keynes. And you could say this is the larger lesson learned by Europe at the end of the Second World War. It's a lesson that's forgotten in the 1970s, but it's a lesson that from the 40s to the 70s basically, say, dominates Europe. We must find a basis for organizing society beyond the individualism of rational self-interest. Individualism of rational self-interest creates two great differences of wealth in society and ultimately creates an environment that promotes and leads to the strengthening of radical Nazi, fascist and communist movements. If we want to save capitalism from itself, if we want to save capitalism in the context of democracy from itself, we have to do more for ordinary people. That's one of the lessons, you could say, of the 1930s that is learned by the leaders of the post-war world. The other lesson is almost the opposite. The need, first finish up with the welfare state. So the need to extend the economic power of states is one of the takeaways from this. And it's first, you can say, embodied in England in the Beveridge Report of 1942, which seeks to develop a universal health program and social insurance for the British and becomes kind of the model of the welfare state, which is then implemented in Germany and France and everywhere else. The other lesson concerns the individual and might be the lesson of human rights, and is the notion that there is a good or a value beyond the collectivism of majority rule, beyond the democratic, you could say, rule of the most people in society. That we must, in some sense, protect individuals against the political power of states. So these are the two contradictory lessons, I think, that World War II teaches, and it teaches out of, you could say, the phenomenon of Nazism and the rise of Hitler. On the one hand, the need to expand the economic power of states to protect people from social immiseration, from suffering, from poverty. And on the other hand, to protect individuals against the political power of the states when the states turn against them, as it had in the Holocaust or the case of the Jews. In many ways, the modern left has really developed itself out of the principle number one, and the modern right, in some sense, has developed itself and extended itself out of principle number two. The fear of state power, and certainly this is the case in America and perhaps more widely in the world at large, that the fear of the state as a source of a potential source of evil goes back to this notion that we have to protect individuals against the state. And the notion that the state should do more to help people goes back to that first lesson, the lesson of the welfare state. So welfare states begin to emerge, you could say, in Europe after the Second World War in accordance with the first principle. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is made in 1948. Through the new organization, the United Nations, founded in 1945, the 51 member states, to basically integrate the nations of the world into a coherent whole, to fulfill the myth of global solidarity, which is, you could say, the great new promise, or the most important promise of this post-war world. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on December 10th, 1948. I'm going to skip some things here. So far, everything has been pretty coherent. But I want to emphasize, remind you of where we are right now so far in the lecture. That I've introduced you at the beginning to this promise of global solidarity as the great promise of the post-war world, as its kind of revision of the promise of modernity. And I emphasize for you that modernity is not something that Europe or the Soviet Union give up on. But it gets called into question, and then the politics of memory is really the way in which that states and international figures start to question the right way to create this modernity we all want, where development and democracy might go hand in hand. Along the way, we looked at the challenges to this, like from the film Third Man, Harry Lime's figure, and we looked also at the way in which the problem of dealing with Nazism in Europe at large, and in Germany in particular, has basically reduced European society for the first time in history to the position of the colonized. That in the Cold War world, Europe is divided between two powers, America and the Soviet Union, and is much less than ever before in charge of its own destiny. That brings us to this slide here, because Berlin is the place where that divide is expressed in the most dramatic form in the Cold War. The Truman Doctrine of 1947, American President Harry Truman proclaims that there is a fundamental ideological and material political difference between the Soviet Union and America. This is often along with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the moment that seems to inaugurate the Cold War. And over the course of the next few years, we see the Cold War begin with the Berlin blockade and airlift, one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century of the American Berlin airlift during the Soviet blockade, when the Soviet Union basically establishes its own, tries to make Berlin part of its, as a whole, part of its dominion, part of its control. So the standoff really between the Americans and the Soviets over the question of Berlin in 1948 to 49, with the airlift, Americans shipping in food to half of the city over the course of the better part of a year and a half, solidifies and you can say inaugurates the enduring divide between these two worlds. The Berlin Wall doesn't start to go up until 1961 and becomes perhaps the most resonant symbol of that divide, the divide between East and West, between a Europe that is really dominated by Americans on the one hand and by Soviets on the other. It also becomes, of course, a wonderful canvas. And a lot of graffiti on the wall becomes a source of all kinds of speculation and talk about the nature of power. But we see also in, you could say, the division of Berlin, the way in which the mood and the tenor of history has changed. People are tired of history. That history is being made now increasingly by large states, political bureaucracies, organizations, and the notion of the heroic individual who can triumph over it all seems to be disappearing from the discourse. People are concerned with their own educations, with getting a job, with making ends meet. The heroic question of transforming the world for the betterment of all is faded, you could say, from focus. Along the way, the institutions by which this new construction of Europe happens, and in Western Europe, include the following organizations or following moments. You might make a note of these. Bretton Woods is a conference in New Hampshire in America that lays the foundations for the great international organizations that dominate basically the world to today. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, becomes eventually the World Trade Organization in the 1990s. But the notion that, again, this is the promise of global solidarity, that the Americans are really imposing in some ways on Europe or developing, The dollar becomes the dominant currency in the world at this moment too, and a way of sort of controlling the currencies of the world, or as a basis of value. But with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, organizations that are supposed to become, that are charged with, in some sense, helping to ensure global development. It's all about development again, but development coordinated and legitimated by these large bureaucratic organizations. Bretton Woods is that site, the place in America, in New Hampshire, the state of New Hampshire, where all the great leaders of the world meet. Keynes attends as well. Keynes, though, is kind of shunted to the side a little bit, and he's kind of he's upset that he's not given more of a prominent place, because in many ways the policies that are outlined, at least for the first years after the war, are very Keynesian. But it's really the Americans taking the lead in implementing them there. The Marshall Plan of a few years later is this pumping of money into the development again of Europe. The UK gets 26% of this money, France 18%, West Germany 11%. And this is one of those moments you can say that helps to make the Cold War, as the USSR refuses support and claims and starts to chart its own path. One organization that also emerges from this, that sort of also shows American domination, is the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It begins in 1948 as the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, and in 1961 it expands its purview to the entire world. Again, the vision of global solidarity that sees embedded in this organization, trying to create a world where the economic relations are coordinated everywhere. Headquartered in Paris, but largely, again, sponsored by the United States. NATO becomes the military wing of this larger organization. 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, again largely sponsored by the United States, becomes a way of imagining a military consolidation of forces and powers for ensuring the world peace that has not been achieved up until now. One wonders what would have happened if all of these organizations had become powerful and had not been opposed. But they were opposed. And this is part of what makes the myth of global solidarity a myth, in the sense of being false, that you do have the dynamic of the Cold War. Because post-war Eastern Europe starts to emerge and starts to develop according to its own logic and according to a kind of reaction to the American-led, you can say, development of Western Europe. Mark Mazauer, in his book, Dark Continent, page 252, if you want to look it up, asks a really profound and important question about how we should understand what happens in Eastern Europe, whether it is a Soviet takeover or a social revolution. And like all good questions, I think it has to be answered as both on some level. It's that Eastern European countries are doing some of this on their own, but at some point or another, the Soviet Union comes in and imposes its control. Often we don't sufficiently, I think, acknowledge the extent to which the development of Western Europe is really at the behest of America, that American control is really important there. But the same kind of problem or dynamic exists in the East. There's no better example of it, I think, than Czechoslovakia. I often assign a reading that comes from the Czech, from Prague. We're not doing it in this semester, but Hedda Kovály's A Life in Prague is a wonderful account of the idealism that could be seen right after the Second World War as Czech citizens tried to invent their own version of socialism before the Soviet Union came in and took it over from them. We should remember at this point that the Comintern has just dissolved. The Comintern, or the Communist International, was the organization founded in the Russian Revolution that was supposed to represent the Russia's and the Soviet Union's leading role in organizing the communist parties around the whole world. We talked about the headquarters that designed by the engineer Tatlin, or the architect Tatlin, but the Comintern is now defunct. And in place of the Comintern emerge somewhat more limited, but also in other ways more powerful organizations to reorganize the world and bring a kind of global solidarity to the communist side of things. Cominform emerges from 1947 and exists until 1956 as the Information Bureau of the Communist and Workers' Parties. It was actually not founded by Stalin at all. It was founded by Tito in Yugoslavia, based in Belgrade and organized on the basis of nation states. We see the same dynamic in Eastern Europe. Here's the notion that we have to respect the sovereignty of nation states on the one hand, and at the same time develop some kind of institution for getting them to work together so that they don't fight amongst themselves. Ironically, of course, Yugoslavia was thrown out of the common form very quickly by Stalin when it started to oppose some of his directives. So the common form, in some ways, is the most direct replacement of the Comintern. It's the kind of intellectual, ideological organization that seeks to coordinate the work of communist parties all around Europe. The economic wing of the organization is, or not wing of the organization, it's an entirely separate institution, is Comecon, or the 1949 founded Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which is founded in some ways to oppose the effects of the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. This is a Soviet kind of driven affair to bring together Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the USSR, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and I should have the USSR there twice. They're not that important. But then, and later, Albania is joined, and then in 1950, East Germany as well. The vision here again is to create some kind of global international solidarity among the communist economies of the world and to stand against what is appearing as American hegemony in Western Europe. So the common form, Comecon, these are two important institutions, you could say, of the Cold War and for organizing power in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact is perhaps the most important of all. 1955, designed in some ways to counterbalance NATO. These are the countries, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, the USSR, and Albania until 1968, trying to form a kind of military alliance against, there are some other countries involved as well, but a kind of military alliance that can stand up to American-led or controlled domination or dominance of Western Europe. I'm going to skip over, there's a little bit here. I'll leave the slide up for a moment so you can read it later on Panopto if you want. But I'll point out just that Tito's Yugoslavia is a great example of some of the ways in which the promise or myth of global or international solidarity in the East is also a myth in the sense of being false. That the attempt to create unity among all these different communist parties and nations also leads to the breaking off of some of them. And Tito is the first and most successful, you can say, to break off. A little bit here on Yugoslavia and Tito's own background. I mean, it's interesting that in 1947 he was still sufficiently powerful in the region to be the very founder of Common Form. But until he was expelled from, so Yugoslavia was expelled from Common Form. And he chose his own path to national communism. But the Belgrade Conference, established in 1961, inaugurates also the non-aligned movement. And this is the birth and the beginning, you could say, of the Third World, along with the earlier Bandung Conference in Indonesia. In some ways, Yugoslavia then becomes a symbol of the desire for a third way, a third path that is not subject to the capitalism of the Americans or the communism, or the Soviet communism of the Soviet Union. Ceausescu's Romania is another example of a country that somehow, in some ways, does its own thing. Directly occupied by the Soviet Union until the late 1950s, Romanians feel that they are, like some other Eastern European countries, having their natural resources drained. That Comecon is not actually benefiting Romanian interests, it's simply taking from Romania for the Soviet interests. Exploitative Sovroms are not really serving the interests of the Romanian people. In 1948, the state began to nationalize private firms and to collectivize agriculture, to do the same things that the Soviet Union had done earlier. It also developed its own secret police, its Securitate. It started purging its own enemies of the people. In 1965, Nicolae Ceausescu took over from the kind of weak-willed head of the party and leader of the state, George Idei, and becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party of Romania. It's a very interesting sort of rise to power. I had a good friend who got married in Bucharest, and I attended the wedding back in the year 2000, where Valentin Ceausescu, the one surviving son of Ceausescu, was actually the godfather at the wedding. He was the one who hadn't been put to death or hadn't been executed. But Ceausescu has perhaps one of the most controversial and most provocative legacies in Eastern Europe. He's known for building this megalomaniacal architecture, Ceausismo, or is the 1980s term for urban renewal policies of Bucharest, building one of the largest palaces in Europe. But Ceausescu's reputation in the 60s was entirely open. He was celebrated by a lot of people who, very unexpected sources. He was celebrated by Westerners, by Americans, by the British, by the French, as being the only Warsaw Pact country that refused to participate in the 1968 Soviet invasion of Prague, led by Brezhnev. So Ceausescu was seen as a leader in the Soviet bloc who could stand up to Brezhnev and to the Soviet Union, who had his own point of view, even as in the subsequent decades he came to be known as perhaps one of the bloodiest sort of dictators in his policies toward his own people in the 70s and in the 80s. One thing that I guess I wanted to point out with all of this, and I need to move on quick, but is that Ceausescu, Tito, like Stalin and Hitler, like kind of the great and dictators or leaders of the 20th century, came from very humble origins. And in many ways, this is one of the ironic ways in which the promise of modernity is fulfilled, or the promises you can see of the Bible. The last shall be first. The people who have the least shall have the most. The domination of Eastern Europe by dictators is not by members of the former elite or members of an aristocracy. It's usually by members of former peasants or former proletarians who suddenly rise to power. Ceausescu basically came from an illiterate family, and his wife did as well. Now, one way to see this in something more concrete terms is to look at two cities in particular. To see this, I mean the way in which Europe comes to be divided for the first time between America and the Soviet Union, and the way in which the impact of America and the Soviet Union is one that the politics of memory has to confront over the course of the next few decades. I've reduced, in case we run out of time, for the sake of efficiency, these two stories to 3 bullet points each. The story of Paris is really the story first of Nazification. Of course, Paris is taken over by Hitler. It's invaded. It's not part of Vichy France. It's part of the occupied France. So the Nazi domination is the first part of that story. But then after the war, it's the story of kind of American influence and American money and Americanization. And in May 1968, this is the third point in the story, in reduced summarized form, we see one of the great outbreaks of student protests and worker protests, one of the largest worker protests in the history of France, combined with the protests at the Nanterre campus in Paris, or university. Nanterre pas tes rêves, sort of the slogan of the revolution, don't bury your dreams. And that students rising up against authority, questioning authority, are also questioning the legacy of the past, the connection, what happened, the trauma of Nazification, then of Americanization, and Charles de Gaulle as the president's place in kind of creating this new world order that perhaps as too consumerist, too Americanized. In a similar way, you could say Prague undergoes Nazification first. It's dominant. It's taken over by Hitler. It's ruled by the Nazis, and then later it is taken over or dominated by the Soviets. And the Prague Spring that happens basically at the same time as this outbreak of unrest in Paris is a similar expression of dissatisfaction and discontent on the part of students, again, with the way in which they've been dominated by foreign powers, but the way in which that foreign domination has translated into the workings of their own society. I think this is one thing to remember about the post-war world, whether we're in the West or in the East, is that the domination by foreign powers has completely reshaped and changed the relations of the domestic society. One can see this very well in the Prague memoir, the question of who betrayed you to the Nazis, or who gave up your family. This is, of course, a question that's also very actual or very real in Paris, too. How, under these different occupation regimes, people interacted with one another. What we see in some level is the complete destruction of social trust. And maybe that's one thing to take away from this larger lecture, is how social trust is severely damaged or hurt by these various forms of occupation and domination in the post-war world. In particular ways, here's an interesting, in Czechoslovakia, we see, one way in which there's an attempt to kind of preserve, you could say, some form of national self-determination and yet claim kind of allegiance to the Soviet Union is in parades like this International Children's Day Parade of 1949 in Budapest, Hungary. The Czechoslovak delegation parades with portraits of Stalin on the one hand and Gottwald, sort of the head of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, on the other. But ultimately, this leads to a very, you can say again, a divided society with complete destruction of social trust. The Slansky trial of 1952 is the great example of that. In November of 1952, Rudolf Slansky, the general secretary, pictured here, of the Czech Communist Party, and 13 other leading party members, 11 of them Jewish, are all put on trial. And you can see the party is divided. The two leading members of the Communist Party in the Czech Republic, in Czechoslovakia, Slansky and Gottwald, one is on the side of the accusers, and the other is on the side of the accused. What are they accused of? They're accused of, again, in an old-fashioned fashion, of an alleged Trotskyite, Titoite, Zionist conspiracy. 11 are hanged in Prague, 3 spend life in prison, and the split, you could say, in the communist leadership is part of a Stalin-inspired purge of disloyal elements happening in the national communist parties all across Central Europe. But this is one particularly prominent and important example of how, again, this promise of global solidarity that both the Soviet Union and Europe want to achieve cannot be achieved ultimately. The problem of national memory is just as much a problem in France. And the large question, the big question, and in some ways this is a question for all of Western Europe, but I think it's been most significantly documented and studied in France, is the question of whether you were a collaborator or resistors, or collaboration and resistance. Charles de Gaulle, pictured at the top, of course, wanted to develop the vision of France as a nation of resistors, people who had stood up to the Nazis and who had opposed them. He'd been an officer in World War I and was the leader of Free France in exile during the Second World War. He was called, a National Assembly calls him back, and so he arrives in France at the end of the Second World War with a kind of national mandate to lead the country. But things start to disintegrate in the 1950s. The Fourth Republic gives way to the Fifth Republic. And though he's president of France all the way really up through the controversies and the uprising of 1968, the divisions in society are a big source, you could say, of his lack of, or his fall. The figure that you could say whose legacy has created this kind of problem is Marshal Philippe Pétain, a national hero in the First World War, a hero of Verdun, prime minister, a chief of the state of Vichy France, when that's the southern part of France that was nominally independent. He was sentenced to death for sort of collaboration with Hitler, which was commuted to life in prison, and ultimately dies in 1951. Well, here's a picture of Hitler and Pétain shaking hands. I think we have to leave it in just a second, but let me go on just for one or two more minutes here, simply to say that that we have in all of this the larger point. I mean, so the takeaway from today's lecture, I think, should be that the attempt in the post-war world to build society, to save modernity from itself, to create a kind of global vision of democracy and development and of modernity itself, fails first and foremost because Europe is divided. It's divided between the kind of dominating powers of the Americans on the one hand and the Soviets on the other. And even as the Soviets and the Americans, each in their own way, try to build kind of a unified vision, Europe and Europeans are very much conscious of the extent to which that they are not entirely being respected as the makers of their own destiny, as the subjects and the objects of their own development. On that note, I'll leave us for today, and we'll get to Bakhtin and to Barth next week. I didn't manage to do it this time. But as I said at the very beginning, and I'll remind you right now, Bakhtin and Barth are important because they are analyzers of language. In a world where people have lost their confidence in their own power to make their own destiny, they've become very interested in how language works to construct power, how language works to construct meaning, how language works to construct culture. And both Barth in France and Bakhtin in the Soviet Union, I think, become enormously popular scholars and very influential scholars as people who help the world to understand how power is constructed through language and how the discourse of power works in different ways. Now, Barth does this through analyzing the mythologies of France, looking at the way in which different aspects of French popular culture and French society serve certain interests, make people believe certain things, conform them to certain ideologies, usually capitalist ideologies. In some ways, it's ironic and interesting that Bakhtin is the more idealistic of the two. Bakhtin gives us a way in which language might actually create a space for freedom, even though he's working and writing under much more repressive conditions. But in reading his essay on the epic and the novel, notice how he juxtaposes these two genres. The epic, what is the epic? What is the story told through an epic? To what extent is the story I've been telling you in this course an epic? Or is it in some ways a novel? And why does he prefer the novel? How is the novel, as a modern form of literary discourse, better for saving people and preserving people's freedom from the powers of states and forces that want to dominate?